The polished mahogany table felt cold beneath my sweating palms. Courtroom 3B always smelled of decaying paper, floor wax, and stale anxiety, but today it smelled like an execution. My execution. Across the aisle, Aunt Nicole adjusted her heavy diamond tennis bracelet, the silver links flashing under the harsh lights. Next to her, Uncle Connor leaned back, a smug, oily smile plastered across his face. They did not look like grieving relatives who had lost a patriarch. They looked like vultures waiting for the carcass to stop twitching. The judge, a weathered man named Miller with dark, heavy bags under his eyes, shuffled the thick stack of legal papers on his bench. He did not look at me. Experienced judges rarely look at the person they are about to financially ruin. Before today, I always thought the viral podcasts overdramatized these family feuds, turning agonizing betrayals into cheap revenge stories designed for public entertainment. But sitting here alone, feeling the raw, unfiltered malice radiating from my own flesh and blood, I realized the reality was far more grotesque. Nicole and Connor weren't just estranged family members. They were ruthless, greedy heirs who had spent the last 7 years meticulously fabricating a parallel reality where I didn't exist, all to tear the keys of Blackwood Estate from my hands. "Pack your trash and get the hell out of my mansion, Hannah," Nicole had hissed in the hallway just an hour ago, her breath smelling of black coffee. "You're a penniless leech. You always have been." I hadn't replied. I hadn't given her the satisfaction of a tear or a defensive shout. I just watched the slight, almost imperceptible tremor in her jaw, the desperation masked by her expensive arrogance. Now inside the courtroom, Judge Miller cleared his throat, a dry, raspy sound like gravel grinding inside a rusty blender. He lifted his heavy wooden gavel. The air in the room grew thick, suffocatingly hot. I gripped the edges of my empty defense table. No high-priced legal team sat beside me. No associates, no paralegals shuffling color-coded folders. Just me, a cheap yellow legal pad, and a plastic pen. My throat was bone-dry, tasting faintly of copper. "Based on the notarized codicil presented by the defense," Judge Miller began, his monotone voice echoing off the outdated wood-paneled walls, "this court finds the plaintiff's claims of systemic forgery unsubstantiated. The primary ownership of the Blackwood Estate is hereby awarded to..." Thud. The heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom didn't just swing open. They hit the plaster walls with a sudden violent crack that made the aging bailiff snap his right hand toward his holster. The old analog clock above the jury box clicked forward to exactly 11:11. Every head turned. The smug, self-satisfied sneer on Connor's face froze mid-breath. Nicole's hand stopped dead, her sharp, manicured nails digging deep into the leather of her designer purse. A man stepped over the brass threshold. He wore a black three-piece suit, tailored so flawlessly it made the defense's corporate attorneys look like they bought their clothes from a discount rack. His polished Oxford shoes clicked against the linoleum tile with absolute, rhythmic precision. He carried a single, thick black leather briefcase with tarnished brass locks. He didn't glance at the spectators, nor did he acknowledge my aunt and uncle. His eyes, sharp and cold as shattered flint, fixed directly on the bench. "Your Honor," the man said. His voice wasn't booming, but it possessed a quiet, terrifying authority that instantly vacuumed the remaining oxygen out of the room. "I suggest you put that gavel down. My name is Alexander Vance, and I represent the irrevocable estate of the late Arthur Blackwood." The judge froze. The wooden gavel remained suspended in mid-air, inches from the block. I let out a slow, quiet breath I didn't realize I'd been holding for 7 agonizing years. I turned my head just enough to look at Nicole, whose tanned face had suddenly turned the exact color of curdled milk. Beside her, Connor began to sweat, a single thick bead tracing down his temple. The legal trap was finally perfectly sprung, and their absolute worst nightmare was only beginning. The silence in courtroom 3B tightened like a wet rawhide noose. Alexander Vance stood there, an unyielding monolith in black wool, his presence stopping the world on its axis. But as the judge stared down at that sealed envelope, the suffocating courtroom faded. My mind leaked backward, slipping down the long dark corridor of the last 7 years, straight to the very root of the rot. To the house. To the memory of how completely they had broken me before I learned how to fight back. Blackwood Estate wasn't just $15 million of prime Hudson Valley real estate, though if you ask the predatory developers circling it like coyotes, That's all it was. To me, it was the smell of cedar shavings, beeswax, and cherry pipe tobacco. It was the comforting, predictable creak of the third stair on the grand oak staircase that my grandfather, Arthur Blackwood, had polished by hand every single spring. He used to sit on that bottom step, pull my small hands into his calloused palms, and say, "A house has a spine, Hannah Bear. If you treat the wood right, it'll hold you up when your own bones want to give out." My parents had died on an icy stretch of Interstate 95 when I was only 8, leaving behind nothing but a shattered sedan and a terrified, mute little girl. Grandfather didn't hesitate. He brought me to Blackwood, gave me a room with windows facing the eastern sun, and rebuilt my shattered world piece by piece. But to Aunt Nicole and Uncle Connor, Blackwood was never a home. It was an unpaid dividend. It was a giant limestone ATM that was taking entirely too long to pay out. The last 2 years of grandfather's life were a slow, agonizing descent into the gray fog of vascular dementia. His brilliant mind, the mind that had built a manufacturing empire from a rented garage in Queens, began to fray at the edges like an old linen cuff. And who was there to catch the pieces? Not Nicole. She was in Palm Beach, getting her third facelift and charging the recovery suite to Arthur's secondary corporate account. Not Connor. He was too busy dodging a grand jury investigation into his failed real estate syndicate in Jersey City, drinking away his anxieties at high-end country clubs. It was just me, the hospice nurses, and the heavy, crushing weight of impending loss. I remember the nights when the fever spiked, when he didn't know his own name, let alone mine. I washed his frail, paper-thin skin with warm water and lavender oil. I held his trembling hand when the sundown terrors came, when he screamed about the long-dead factory machines he thought were crushing his chest. My hands grew rough from lifting him. My eyes were permanently rimmed with red from the lack of sleep. I put my entire life on hold. I dropped out of my master's program at Columbia, because a paid nurse couldn't give him what he actually needed: dignity. Someone who truly loved him for the man he was, not the wealth he held. And then, right on cue, the vultures would land. Once a month, Nicole would breeze into the house, trailing the overpowering scent of Chanel No. 5 mixed with artificial sympathy. She wouldn't even take off her leather driving gloves. She'd stand at the foot of his bed, looking at her own dying father with a mixture of disgust and impatience, as if he were a flight that had been terribly delayed. "Is he still breathing?" she'd whisper to the doctor, not even bothered that I was sitting right there in the corner chair. "The accountant says the corporate liquidity is drying up. We need to finalize the transfer of the commercial titles before he goes completely brain-dead, Hannah. You understand that, right?" "He's still your father, Nicole," I said, my voice cracking from sheer exhaustion. She turned on me, her eyes narrowing into 2 icy, venomous slits. "Don't you dare lecture me, you little charity case. You've lived under his roof, eating his food, spending his money for over a decade. You're nothing but a glorified, unpaid maid. When his heart stops, the free ride is officially over. Make sure you pack your cheap bags before the funeral." Connor was worse because he hid his malice behind a boisterous, fake Irish warmth that made my stomach turn. He'd pat grandfather on his sunken shoulder, laughing too loud, before pulling me out into the hallway. His thick fingers would dig into my upper arm, hard enough to leave yellow-green bruises the next morning. "Listen to me, girlie," he'd hiss, his beer and cigar breath hot against my face. "We know what you're doing. You're whispering in his ear, trying to get him to change the will. If we find out you've touched a single dime of our inheritance, we will sue you into the absolute dirt. We'll make sure you can't even get a job flipping burgers in this state. You don't belong in this family. You're just a stray he felt sorry for." The asymmetry was absolute, grinding, and designed to make me break. They cut off the household allowance, forced me to pay for grandfather's specialized vitamins out of my meager savings, and monitored the security cameras to ensure I didn't take a single piece of silver. They wanted a fight. They wanted me to scream, to throw a tantrum, to give them the legal ammunition to claim I was unstable and dangerous to an old man. But I didn't break. I swallowed the bile. I stood my ground, keeping my spine perfectly straight, just like grandfather taught me. The louder they got, the quieter I became. My silence wasn't weakness, it was a vault. The end came on a brutal, rain-slick Tuesday in November. The house felt unnaturally cold, the radiator clicking like a dying pulse. The hospice nurse had stepped out to fetch fresh linens, leaving us completely alone. Grandfather's breathing had changed, that terrible rhythmic rattling sound that tells you the soul is already standing at the exit. Suddenly, his eyes snapped open. For the first time in 6 months, the gray fog was entirely gone. They were the sharp, piercing blue eyes of the man who had raised me. He looked at me, really looked at me, and a single tear tracked down into the deep creases of his weathered cheek. He couldn't speak. The last stroke had stolen his voice weeks ago. But his right hand, weak and trembling, fumbled beneath the heavy down comforter. He grabbed my wrist with a sudden desperate strength that shocked me. He pressed something hard and cold into my palm. It was a small heavy key made of tarnished brass, attached to a thick black nylon cord. It didn't belong to any door or drawer in Blackwood Estate. I had never seen it before in my life. "Hannah," he wheezed, the sound barely a ghost of a whisper. He nodded his head toward his old, locked roll-top desk in the corner of the study, then looked back into my eyes. His grip tightened one final time. A silent, profound command. "Trust me." Then, his hand went completely slack. The bedside monitor let out that long, flat, horrifying tone that means the world has just changed forever. I didn't cry. Not then. I closed his eyes, kissed his cool forehead, and slipped the brass key into the deepest pocket of my cardigan. I knew the storm was coming, and I knew I had to survive it alone. The legal battle that followed was a nightmare of forged codicils, expensive lawyers, and systemic isolation. They stripped me of my home, my name, and my sanity, confident that a penniless granddaughter could never stand against their wealth. They thought they had won the moment they pushed me into this courtroom. They thought they had left me with nothing. But as I sat at that defense table, feeling the cold brass key still hidden in the lining of my purse, I knew the truth. They had only set the stage for their own destruction. 7 years is a long time to play dead. It requires a specific kind of psychopathy, the ability to sit perfectly still while fools build a bonfire out of your life and dance around the ashes. Most people think rage is loud. They think it's broken glass and screaming matches in the driveway. It isn't. Real predatory rage is silent. It's a cold, flat fluid that fills your lungs until you learn to breathe underwater. Nicole and Connor thought they had broken me because I didn't hire a lawyer after the funeral. They mistook my lack of noise for a total lack of spine. When they moved their greasy, entitlement-soaked lives into Blackwood Estate, I didn't throw a tantrum. I simply packed my single suitcase, moved into the drafty carriage house over the garage, and let the shadows take me. I became the resident ghost. The orphan girl who cleaned up their messes and never looked them in the eye. It didn't take long for the rot to show. Within 6 months, the house began to smell different. The comforting scent of grandfather's cherry tobacco was aggressively scrubbed away, replaced by the stinging stink of bleach and Nicole's toxic clouds of Chanel No. 5. They didn't care about the history etched into the floors. They cared about the staging. Nicole threw weekly, frantic cocktail parties for pseudo-celebrities and local politicians. Her face stretched so tight from plastic surgery she looked like a panicked porcelain doll. I'd watch from the dark edge of the lawn as she spilled expensive Pinot Noir onto grandfather's hand-woven Persian rugs, laughing that high, brittle laugh that always sounded like glass cracking in a sink. "Look at her out there," I heard Nicole whisper to a guest one evening, pointing her manicured finger toward the carriage house window where I stood. "Arthur's little charity case. Still haunting the property like a stray cat. We'd kick her off, but it's bad for my image until the probate clears. She's completely harmless. Brain like pudding, just like her parents." I didn't blink. I didn't feel my throat tighten. I just made a mental note of the time, the date, and the guest she was speaking to. Connor was worse because his arrogance was fueled by a leaking bank account. He was drowning in bad debt from a failed marina project in Atlantic City, and Blackwood was his life raft. He brought sweaty, red-faced hard money lenders into grandfather's private study. I watched through the keyhole as he used a crowbar to smash open the antique roll-top desk, hunting for physical bonds or hidden cash. When he found nothing but old tax receipts, he spat on the hardwood floor and swore. He didn't understand that Arthur Blackwood hadn't kept his real wealth in a wooden box. That's where the brass key came in. They thought they knew everything about the old man, but they only knew his shell. They didn't know about his paranoia. the beautiful, meticulous paranoia of a self-made millionaire who knew exactly what kind of vultures his siblings had raised. The small, tarnished key grandfather slipped into my hand on his deathbed didn't fit any lock in the mansion. It belonged to a private, high-security safety deposit box at a nondescript boutique bank in downtown Manhattan. I went there 3 weeks after the funeral, shivering in a cheap raincoat. Inside that steel box there were no gold bars. There was a single, encrypted solid-state drive and a piece of heavy stationery with grandfather's sharp handwriting. Asterisk, they will think you are weak, Hannah Bear. Let them. Arrogant people don't look down at their feet until they're already falling through the ice. Asterisk for 7 long years, while they treated Blackwood like a personal piggy bank, I sat in the dark of the carriage house with a refurbished laptop and a burner hotspot. The drive contained login credentials to a hidden, mirrored server that tracked every single corporate entity, offshore account, and secondary trust associated with the Blackwood name. Grandfather had set a digital tripwire. Nicole and Connor thought they were skimming the estate with total impunity. They didn't realize that every time they moved money, a silent notification pinged my screen. I watched Connor forge grandfather's signature on a retroactive deed transfer, trying to collateralize the mansion for a $4 million hard loan from a shady syndicate in Queens. I watched Nicole use the estate's tax-exempt foundation to launder her personal gambling debts from trips to Nassau, marking them down as charitable administrative expenses. They were so loud, so incredibly messy. They left a digital blood trail across 3 different banking jurisdictions, entirely convinced that the quiet girl in the carriage house was too stupid to understand what a ledger even was. They would cut off my hot water to amuse themselves, or leave past due electric notices on my porch with nasty little post-it notes telling me to find a real job. Connor even cornered me by the trash cans once, pinning me against the brick wall with his heavy, alcohol-soaked frame. "You're nothing," he'd whispered, his teeth gray against the moonlight. "We own the lawyers. We own the paper. You're just a squatter we haven't bothered to scrape off our boots yet." I kept my eyes down. I let my shoulders slump. I gave him the exact picture of a defeated, hollowed-out victim he needed to see to keep himself sloppy. "Yes, Uncle Connor," I whispered, mimicking the tremor of a broken thing. He laughed, patted my cheek hard enough to sting, and walked away. He had no idea that less than an hour prior, I had downloaded the final unredacted wire transfer receipt proving he had bribed a state notary with $50,000 of stolen estate cash to certify their fake codicil. They thought they were eating the house from the inside out. They thought they were the predators. They never realized that my 7 years of silence wasn't submission. It was a countdown. And today in Courtroom 3B, the timer hit 0. The Westchester County Surrogates Court was a monument to institutional indifference. A place where messy family histories were completely reduced to docket numbers and statutory percentages. On that humid Tuesday morning, the air conditioning system in Courtroom 3B was failing, emitting a low rhythmic rattle that synced perfectly with the anxious thrumming of my pulse. I sat behind the scratched oak defense table, entirely unescorted. To the state of New York, I was a pro se litigant, a polite legal term for someone too broke to afford justice. My entire arsenal consisted of a cheap yellow legal pad, a scratchy black ballpoint pen, and 7 long years of hard-boiled patience. Across the aisle, the scenery was vastly different. Nicole and Connor had not just hired a lawyer, they had purchased a corporate armada. Sitting at the plaintiff's table was Marcus Stone, the senior managing partner of Vanguard and Croft, a white shoe firm out of Manhattan that did not open its doors for less than $900 an hour. Stone was a predatory animal wrapped in an immaculate charcoal Brioni suit. His silver hair was perfectly shellacked, and a gold Rolex Submariner gleamed from beneath his starched French cuffs every time he turned a page. Flanking him were 3 junior associates, pale young men with identical Ivy League degrees, who spent their mornings frantically shuffling color-coded, leather-bound binders and whispering into encrypted tablets. Nicole and Connor sat directly behind their expensive legal shield. Nicole had spent the morning adjusting her gold rings, her sharp, heavily contoured face fixed in a permanent expression of aristocratic boredom. She did not look at me. To Nicole, I was already evicted, a minor clerical error she was waiting for the state to erase. Connor was more overt. He leaned back in his leather chair, his thick legs crossed, casually checking his reflection in the polished wood of the spectator railing. Occasionally, he would lean over to whisper something to Stone, followed by a low, self-satisfied chuckle that rattled around the high ceilings of the courtroom. They were not just confident. They were entirely certain that the legal system worked exactly the way they had paid it to work. When Judge Miller called the case in re estate of Arthur Blackwood, Stone did not just stand. He took physical possession of the courtroom. He glided toward the mahogany lectern with the smooth, unhurried grace of a man who spent his weekends playing golf with the administrative judges of the circuit. "Your Honor," Stone began, his voice a rich baritone purr that filled every corner of the room. "This is a remarkably straightforward matter that has unfortunately been dragged out by the groundless emotional delusions of the defendant. For 7 years my clients, the rightful and designated heirs under the 2019 codicil to Mr. Blackwood's will, have allowed the defendant to reside in the carriage house out of pure familial charity. But charity has its legal limits." He paused, turning just enough to cast a brief, pitying glance in my direction. It was a practiced theatrical move designed entirely for the court record. "We have provided this court with the fully executed, notarized amendment to the estate," Stone continued, lifting a crisp sheet of high-grade bond paper with an air of religious reverence. "The signature of Arthur Blackwood has been verified by 2 independent handwriting experts. The document clearly states that due to the defendant's systemic lack of corporate competence, the entirety of the Blackwood estate, including the primary residence and all associated liquid trusts, is to be divided equally between his surviving children, Nicole and Connor. The defendant's claims of probate fraud are not only unsubstantiated, Your Honor, they are an insult to the memory of a great man." I watched the court reporter's fingers fly across her machine, capturing Stone's elegant lies into permanent legal fact. I did not object. I did not jump up and shout. Under the strict rules of New York civil procedure, an unrepresented party who throws a tantrum is simply fast-tracking their own defeat. I kept my eyes fixed on my yellow pad, my pen drawing a small precise circle on the top line. The silence from my side of the room was heavy, a dense vacuum that Stone used to his absolute advantage. Judge Miller sighed, an exhausted sound that told the story of his packed docket. He was 68, counting down the months to mandatory retirement, and had no desire to referee a bitter family feud when the paperwork looked immaculate. He adjusted his half-rimmed glasses and flipped through the 600-page motion for summary judgment. "The legal machinery does not care about the nights I spent wiping sweat from my grandfather's forehead. Cares about ink on paper. And the ink before Judge Miller said I was a squatter." "Miss Blackwood," Judge Miller said, his voice dry as parchment as he looked down at me, "do you have any expert testimony or counter-affidavits to present this morning regarding the validity of the 2019 codicil? Anything beyond your initial filed petition?" I stood up slowly, the cheap wood of my chair scraping loudly against the floor tile. "No, Your Honor," I said quietly, keeping my voice perfectly level, completely devoid of the absolute desperation they were all waiting to hear. "I do not have legal counsel present with me today." Connor let out a short, wet snort from the gallery behind me. Stone smiled, a tiny razor-thin movement of his lips, and sat back down next to Nicole, who patted his arm triumphantly. They had me cornered. They had spent 7 long, agonizing years bleeding my savings dry, ensuring I could never afford an examiner. Miller nodded, the finality cutting through the humid air like an axe. He slowly, deliberately picked up his heavy wooden gavel. "The motion for summary judgment is hereby granted," Judge Miller announced coldly. "Miss Blackwood is ordered to vacate the premises within 72 hours. The analog clock on the wall clicked to 11:11. And that was when the world stopped. The gavel did not fall. It remained suspended in Judge Miller's right hand, a 2-pound block of polished walnut hovering 5 inches above the striking block. The echo of the heavy oak doors slamming against the plaster walls was still vibrating in the small, hot room. It was a sharp, concussive crack that didn't just disrupt the proceedings. It broke the entire institutional rhythm of Courtroom 3B. The old bailiff, whose eyes had been half closed for most of the morning, was suddenly upright, his gray hand hovering instinctively over the leather snap of his service holster. The man who had caused the disruption did not pause at the brass bar of the spectator gallery. He walked right through the swinging gate with an icy, unhurried stride that signaled absolute, non-negotiable authority. He was a tall man, somewhere in his late 50s, with thick silver hair combed straight back from a high-lined forehead. His black three-piece suit was woolen silk, tailored with the kind of severe precision that makes a man look larger than he actually is. In his left hand, he carried a heavy black leather briefcase with tarnished brass latches. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at Marcus Stone, or the three associates who were currently scrambling to their feet like startled pigeons. His eyes, a pale, washed-out gray, were fixed entirely on the bench. "Mr. Stone," Judge Miller said, his voice dropping an octave into a tone of deep irritation, though his gavel hand slowly descended to the desk without striking. "Who is this? Is this one of your partners?" Marcus Stone was already adjusting his silk tie, his professional veneer cracking just enough for a flash of genuine confusion to show through. He looked at the stranger, then down at his legal pads, as if searching for a name that wasn't there. "No, Your Honor. The plaintiff has no knowledge of this individual. This is a closed summary judgment hearing. This man has no standing. I have the only standing that matters in this room, Mr. Stone," the man in the black suit said. His voice was a low, resonant baritone, entirely free of the nasal New York cadence that filled the rest of the courthouse. It was the dry, flat accent of the mid-Atlantic elite, the sound of old money and federal boardrooms. He stopped exactly 3 feet from the plaintiff's table, ignoring the predatory glare Stone was throwing at him. "State your name for the record," Judge Miller muttered, leaning forward, his leather chair giving off a loud, protesting groan. "And you better have a damn good reason for interrupting my record, counselor." "My name is Alexander Vance," the man said. He lifted the briefcase and placed it flat on the mahogany podium with a single dull thud. "I am the senior managing trustee of the Blackwood Sovereign Trust, established under the laws of the state of Delaware in 2012. I am also the designated personal representative for the late Arthur Blackwood regarding all non-probate asset allocations." A sudden sharp intake of air hissed behind me. It came from Aunt Nicole. I didn't turn around, but I could hear the frantic metallic clicking of her diamond bracelets as her hands began to shake. Beside her, Uncle Connor cleared his throat, a wet, panicked sound that ended in a dry cough. Marcus Stone stepped forward, his corporate arrogance reasserting itself. "Your Honor, this is absurd. The estate of Arthur Blackwood has been through a 2-year probate review in this county. The 2019 codicil, which this court just validated, supersedes any prior trust structures. This is a transparent delay tactic by the defendant." He pointed a long manicured finger at me. "She's desperate." Vance didn't even turn his head to look at Stone. He reached down, pressed the brass buttons on his briefcase, and the locks popped open with a loud metallic clack. "Mr. Stone, if you had spent less time billing your clients for golf outings and more time examining the public records of the Delaware Chancery Court, you would know that an irrevocable sovereign trust cannot be superseded by a subsequent testamentary codicil. Not in this state. Not in any state in the Union." He reached into the briefcase and pulled out a thick, legal-sized envelope. It was heavy black paper, completely opaque, and sealed across the back seam with 3 distinct discs of dark maroon wax. The wax was stamped with an old, intricate signet ring, the crest of the Blackwood family foundry that grandfather had closed 40 years ago. "Your Honor," Vance said, stepping toward the bench with the envelope held between his thumb and forefinger. "Pursuant to Section July 1, 11 of the New York Estates, Powers and Trusts Law, I am presenting the original unredacted master trust agreement executed by Arthur Blackwood on October 14, 2016. This document was placed in absolute escrow, to be delivered to this court only upon the specific occurrence of a conditional event." Judge Miller looked at the black envelope as if it were a live grenade. "And what was that conditional event, Mr. Vance?" "The entry of a judicial order attempting to alienate Hannah Blackwood from the primary residence at Blackwood Estate," Vance said quietly. The courtroom became so quiet I could hear the faint, high-pitched whine of the old fluorescent lights in the ceiling. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a wild rhythmic thudding that made it hard to breathe, but my face remained completely still. I looked at the yellow legal pad in front of me. The small circle I had drawn was perfectly neat. Judge Miller reached out a spotted, wrinkled hand and took the envelope, He used a silver letter opener from his desk, the blade sliding through the heavy black paper with a crisp, slicing sound that felt incredibly loud. He pulled out a stack of cream-colored vellum papers, bound at the top with green silk ribbon. I watched his face. Scott Turow once wrote that a judge's face is the only true thermometer in a litigation. If the glass cracks, the case is dead. For the first 30 seconds, Miller's expression was merely bored, the look of an old man reading through familiar boilerplate language. But then, as his eyes reached the third page, his jaw went completely slack. The corners of his mouth twitched downward. His eyes widened behind his half-rimmed glasses, darting back and forth across the lines with a frantic, unnatural speed. The healthy, florid color in his cheeks seemed to drain away, leaving his skin the shade of old parchment. He didn't speak. He just stared. He turned the page, his thumb trembling slightly against the edge of the vellum. "Your Honor," Marcus Stone said, his voice losing its smooth, baritone confidence, rising into a higher, anxious register. "Your Honor, whatever that document is, we have a right to examine it. We object to any ex parte submissions at this stage of the summary proceeding." Judge Miller ignored him. He was reading the fourth page now, his breath coming in short, shallow puffs through his nose. He looked up from the paper, his gaze slowly shifting across the room. He didn't look at me. He looked directly at Nicole and Connor. It wasn't a look of anger. It was a look of profound, clinical disgust. "Mr. Stone," Judge Miller said, his voice barely above a whisper, the previous monotone authority completely gone. "You might want to tell your clients to sit back down. And you might want to call your firm's criminal defense specialist." I beg your pardon, Your Honor," Stone stammered, stepping back a half step, his hand dropping from the lectern. "This document," Judge Miller said, lifting the vellum papers with a hand that was now visibly shaking, "is an absolute non-discretionary asset lock. It was executed 3 years before your client's alleged codicil. It specifies that on October 14, 2016, Arthur Blackwood transferred the entirety of the real property known as Blackwood Estate, along with $42 million in liquid securities, into an offshore fiduciary structure managed exclusively by Mr. Vance's firm." The judge paused, clearing his throat, his eyes dropping back to the text. "Furthermore, it contains a certified forensic audit report attached as Exhibit C. Mr. Vance, is this what I think it is?" "It is, Your Honor," Vance said, his voice flat, level and deadly. Arthur Blackwood knew his children were systematically dipping into the corporate accounts. He allowed them to continue doing so for years, under our strict supervision, while we logged every single wire transfer, every forged corporate resolution, and every unauthorized draw. Exhibit C contains the bank routing numbers, the IP addresses used for the digital signatures, and the specific accounts in the Cayman Islands where your clients deposited the stolen funds. Behind me, a loud, choking sound came from Uncle Connor, followed by the clatter of a wooden chair tipping over against the spectator rail. The legal trap hadn't just closed, it had completely pulverized them. And Alexander Vance hadn't even opened his second folder yet. The sound of Uncle Connor's chair hitting the linoleum tile was the first real indicator that the veneer had cracked completely. It was an ugly domestic sound, a clumsy, heavy scrape that shattered whatever remaining dignity his expensive clothes had promised. He stayed down for a moment, one knee pressed against the floor, his face the color of wet chalk. His hand fumbled with the mahogany rail, his gold signet ring clicking uselessly against the wood. The bravado that had sustained him through 7 years of systematic theft evaporated in a matter of seconds, leaving behind only the raw, weeping panic of a man who realized the floor beneath him had ceased to exist. "Marcus," Connor choked out, his voice hoarse, stripped of that boisterous country club charm he'd used as a weapon for so long. "Marcus, look at the paper again. There's a mistake." The old man was losing his mind. He didn't know what he was signing in 2016. He was incompetent. Tell the judge he was incompetent. Marcus Stone didn't look at his client. He didn't even look at the 3 junior associates who were already frantically packing their digital tablets into their leather cases. A white shoe lawyer out of Manhattan doesn't survive by being loyal to sinking ships. He survives by knowing exactly when to throw the cargo overboard before the hull splits. Stone's long manicured fingers were already zipping his Toomey briefcase with a sharp, decisive hiss that sounded like a viper sliding through dry grass. "Your Honor," Stone said, his voice dropping into a flat, defensive register that left his clients completely exposed to the elements. In light of these disclosures, Vanguard and Croft must immediately move to withdraw as counsel for the plaintiffs. We were presented with documents we genuinely believe to be authentic. If there has been a material misrepresentation of fact or a systemic fraud practiced upon this court by our clients, our firm cannot continue representation without violating our fundamental ethical obligations under the state bar. "You're leaving us?" Nicole's voice wasn't an aristocratic purr anymore. It was a high, shrill shriek that rattled the glass panes of the courtroom doors. She stood up so fast her heavy pearl necklace caught on the edge of the defense table, the silk string snapping under the sudden tension. White spheres cascaded across the floor, bouncing and rolling into the shadows like tiny tooth-colored skulls. "Marcus, we paid you $100,000 retainer. You fix this. You tell this old bastard he can't do this to us." Stone didn't reply. He picked up his briefcase, bowed slightly to the bench with a chilling display of professional detachment, and walked out through the side door, his 3 associates trailing behind him like a flock of silent, gray crows. They didn't look back. They left Nicole and Connor standing alone behind a desk cluttered with worthless paper, fraudulent codicils, and the broken remnants of a pearl necklace. Judge Miller didn't waste time. He didn't offer a lecture on family values, nor did he indulge in a sermon about the sanctity of an old man's memory. The law at this level is entirely mechanical. A cold, heavy meat grinder that doesn't care about the names on the birth certificates or the blood in the veins. He looked over at the aging bailiff, his expression as unreadable as a slab of New York granite. "Officer," Miller said, his voice flat and heavy as a lead pipe, "secure the courtroom. Contact the district attorney's office, Commercial Fraud Division. Tell them I am issuing an immediate judicial referral for grand larceny, identity theft, and systemic probate fraud. And call downstairs to the sheriff's department. We're going to need transport." The heavy oak doors at the back of the room opened again, but it wasn't a sudden explosion this time. It was a quiet, orderly entrance. 2 state troopers in crisp, gray uniforms and wide-brimmed hats stepped through the threshold. The silver handcuffs hanging from their utility belts gave off a small musical clink with every step they took toward the front of the room. Connor didn't fight. He let his soft, heavy shoulders slump forward, his big body deflating until he looked like an old sack of laundry left out in the rain. He held out his thick wrists without a word, his eyes fixed on the scuffed tips of his leather shoes. The metallic click-click-click of the Smith & Wesson cuffs ratcheting shut over his wrists was the cleanest, most satisfying sound I had heard in 7 years. It was the sound of a ledger balancing itself. Nicole, however, was a creature of pure, unadulterated panic. As the second trooper approached her, she spun around, her manicured hands extended toward me like claws. Her face was distorted, the expensive dermal fillers and tight skin stretching into a grotesque mask of terror that no amount of plastic surgery could conceal. "Hannah! Tell them!" she screamed, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps that smelled of sour coffee. She reached across the aisle, her fingernails scraping violently against the oak of my table. "We're your family. We raised you after your parents died. You can't let them do this to us. Think of what people will say in the town. Think of the family name." I stood up slowly, smoothing the front of my simple wool coat. I didn't feel the hot rush of adrenaline, or the cheap, sugary thrill of a theatrical triumph. I felt cold, entirely, beautifully hollow. I looked down at her trembling hands, then up into her bloodshot, panicked eyes. Gillian Flynn once wrote that love is the world's worst lubricant. It makes everything drag. But hate is a precision tool. It cleans out the joints and leaves you with a perfectly level sightline. "The family name died when you left him alone in that room, Nicole," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it had the flat, unyielding weight of a tombstone settling into place. "You didn't want a family. You wanted an asset. You wanted the limestone, the acreage, and the liquid accounts. Now you have 20 years in Bedford Hills to think about the valuation." "You little bitch!" she shrieked as the trooper caught her upper arm, pivoting her smoothly toward the center aisle. "You planned this. You sat in that garage like a filthy rat and watched us. I did, I whispered, so low only the court reporter's sensitive microphone could catch it. I watched every single dollar. They were let out through the back door, their shoes dragging heavily against the linoleum. The courtroom cleared out within minutes, leaving only the stale smell of fierce sweat and the scattered pearls rolling on the floor. Alexander Vance didn't offer a handshake, nor did he break into a smile. He simply adjusted his silver cuffs, snapped his black briefcase shut, and handed me a heavy brass ring containing the master keys to the property. The locks at Blackwood Estate were changed 2 hours ago, Miss Blackwood, Vance said, his gray eyes showing the first faint glimmer of clinical approval. The private security team is already on site. Your grandfather's accounts have been completely frozen and transferred to the sovereign trust under your sole signature. You are free to go home. Thank you, Alexander, I said. An hour later, I drove up the long, winding gravel driveway of Blackwood Estate. The afternoon sun was cutting through the heavy canopy of ancient oaks, throwing long golden bars across the limestone facade of the mansion. The house was quiet. The toxic artificial scent of Chanel No. 5 had already begun to clear from the rooms, carried away by the sharp, clean breeze coming off the Hudson River. I walked up the grand staircase, my shoes echoing against the old wood. I stopped on the third step, the one that always creaked. I pressed my foot down, listening to that old familiar sound. It didn't sound broken anymore. It sounded like a spine settling back into place. I walked into grandfather's private study. The room was empty, the air tasting faintly of old paper and cedar wood. I pulled the small brass key from my purse, the one he had pressed into my palm on that rainy Tuesday 7 years ago. I didn't need it to unlock a box anymore. The box had already done its work. I placed it gently on the center of the clean, polished desk, right next to an old black and white photograph of him sitting on the bottom step of the stairs laughing. They thought they had left me with nothing, because they didn't understand the true nature of inheritance. To them, legacy was a number in a ledger, a piece of paper you could forge or buy with a white shoe firm. They didn't understand that the most valuable things aren't left to you. They are left in you. Grandfather hadn't just given me a house. He had given me the patience to watch my enemies build their own gallows, and the coldness to pull the lever when the time was right. Justice isn't a moral concept. It's an administrative function. It's the slow, quiet correction of a messy equation, and today the math was finally perfect. I walked over to the wide French windows, looking out over the rolling green lawns that stretched toward the river. The estate was mine. The legacy was safe. And the vultures were exactly where they belonged. If you want to see how deep the legal trap went, and how the evidence was gathered piece by piece, click the video on your screen right now to watch the full breakdown of the financial records that brought down the greedy heirs of Blackwood. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories of ultimate justice.